Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your guest host today, Keith Edwards. I'm filling in for Tony Duty. Today we'll be talking about emotional intelligence in leadership and social justice. You can participate in today's episode by following along on the back channel and tweeting to the hashtag HigherEdLive. Thank you to Erica Thompson for helping out with the back channel today. In a moment, I'll introduce my guest, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to some of the sponsors that make Student Affairs Live possible. Student Affairs Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network, and you can tune into episodes with your regular host, Tony Duty, and his co-host, Heather Shea Gasser, on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're unfamiliar with past episodes, we highly recommend you check out and favorite the archive link that we're tweeting out right now. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Is it time for a website checkup? If you're worried that your site isn't memorable or nervous that your institution won't stand out from every other school that's knocking on prospective students' doors, a website checkup is your first step. We're tweeting out a link now that will shortly, we're tweeting out a link now where you can learn more. ACPA, College Student Educators International, is pleased to provide support for Student Affairs Live. One of the ways many ways you can be involved and innovative with your own professional development. Program notifications just went out for ACPA 2017 in Columbus, Ohio. A fabulous curriculum is being intentionally designed. Register for the convention now at myacpa.org. Now on with today's episode. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone, or maybe even good evening if you're listening to this a little bit later on the recording. Today, I'm joined by three wonderful folks who are going to help us all explore a topic that I'm very excited about. We have Dr. Marilee Bresciani Ludvik, who serves as Professor of Post-Secondary Education Leadership at San Diego State University. Dr. Paige Haber-Curran is a faculty member and program coordinator for the Student Affairs and Higher Education Master's Program at Texas State University. And Dr. Mamta Accapadi is Vice President of Student Affairs at Rollins College. Welcome to each of you, and I'm really looking forward to sharing in the conversation with you today. So today's topic is emotional intelligence, and Marilee, I'd like to start with you. Can you just begin by helping us all understand what this term is and how it is similar or different from other terms viewers and listeners might be familiar with, such as social intelligence, brain science, and positive psychology?
It's a great question. Thank you. I think we're still understanding what emotional intelligence really is. It was coined by Mayer and Salovey quite a while ago, and Daniel Goleman brought it into our attention with his popular book, Working with Emotional Intelligence. And then we've seen other work come out of that. What our team is focusing on when we talk about emotional intelligence is really using more of a neuroscience basis, which is that according to Antonio Damasio's work, the body will do whatever the body is going to do, whether the chooser, the one who's choosing, is aware of that or not. And what we understand is that emotions can be sensed as bodily sensations, and that if we begin to bring awareness to what's happening in the body in relation to sensations, and begin to bring awareness to how those sensations are associated with thoughts, emotions, or feelings, then we can actually begin to become more intelligent about the choices we make, rather than having body just react or and wondering what was that all about. We can actually bring an awareness, a cultivating of an awareness to these experiences.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think it was fascinating to me is that we're here talking about emotional intelligence, and you're talking about a lot about the body and how those are interconnected. And I think that's great as we kind of bring, as student affairs folks, we talk a lot about the whole person, and that's really what we're here talking about. So I've got your great book here. So people can see it. The Neuroscience of Learning and Development. Was able to read through that. Lots of great things there. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more. In that book, you and many of your co-authors for this book that you edited are really calling for a reorganizing of higher education based on what the neuroscience is telling us and cultivating emotional intelligence. Our viewers are mostly student affairs folks, but also some faculty. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of your biggest suggestions for how we might reorganize what we do in student affairs with this new information we have about how our brains work and how students' brains work in cultivating emotional intelligence.
Thank you. Yes, first and foremost, I think people in student affairs are very aware that we are human beings cultivating the learning and development of other human beings. And the way that we've organized access to cultivation of learning and development is very linear. And so in the book, we're calling for a non-linear approach because it's how it gets experienced anyway. So as we understand the neuroscience, that what I pay attention to and focus on literally changes certain structures and therefore functions of the brain, all of those structures are and the functions and the corresponding functions are related to learning and development. So as we first understand that that this is the case, and then we invite in actually the emotional experience of each one of us, as well as our students, because it is regulating. Emotions are playing a role in regulating what gets stored and recalled from memory. They're playing a role in prioritizing decisions, the decisions we actually make. So what is particularly in student affairs, we've been working to create a space for emotions to be integrated with all of the other information that's coming into play. And what we don't do well is, because we're trying to get people through so quickly, is we don't really cultivate a space of reflection for determining how is all of this new stuff I'm experiencing integrating with my lived experience thus far. So the intersectionality of identities. Yeah. And what do I do? What do I do with this? And what do I do when I'm at conflict with something that I'm supposed to be learning, or a colleague on my, a peer on my group team? And because we don't create that space, we can't actually create this integration of these beautiful things called emotions into all of this information stuff that we're getting from all over the place.
Sounds like you're talking a lot about the integration of the head, the heart, the body, the spirit. It really seems like bringing all of that in so that we bring all of those capacities to our learning and development, not just what we know.
Yes, because we don't know what we know comes from. I mean, I can learn something intellectually, but not, but it can be at conflict with my previous lived experience, right? And so, how do we really cultivate transformation in this society that we really desperately need? And that really requires an opportunity for the facilitators of the learning and the development, as well as the ones that we're inviting to take up this information, to actually be with it, sort of lean into it, but do so in a way that's just wrapped with compassion. Because again, what we know from neuroscience is that however many viewers are watching this, there are that many different experiences, and they're all true. They're all true. So when we're trying to create some sort of common movement forward, how do I really step back and say, I see that this is informing my perspective, and how do I suspend that judgment for a moment so I can hear something else? So other possibilities are created. Like, that's transformational learning and development.
Right, and I think that the shifting from education being about what we know to who we are and how we're transformed, and then how we transform the societies that we're a part of, it seems like a sort of a foundational building block. So I want to turn to Paige. I've got another good book here. So Emotionally Intelligent Leadership. Now, Paige, you helped write this book, and I've got the a guide for students, second edition here. You and your co-author, Marcy Levy-Shankman and Scott Allen, wrote this book. How did you see this book trying to encourage a different kind of leadership for college students?
Great. Well, thank you for having me here. And so actually the first edition of this book was published by Marcy and Scott back in 2009. And I actually came to this in a neat way of just coming into this work as a user of it. So I actually met Marcy and Scott through a leadership program and got familiar with their work and really resonated with it. But we went through and we refocused the model for the second edition of the book, which came out last year. And the idea behind it from 2009 and now are pretty similar. And how we came up with this is we really recognize that, especially for their first edition, a lot of the literature and research that was out there around emotional intelligence and some on leadership as well was really focused on business leadership and professional contexts. So some of the pieces that Marilee was just talking about with Mayer and Solovey and Goleman, those were written very informative books, but not necessarily a book that undergraduate students who might be student leaders in various organizations might be able to relate to in terms of the examples that were given or different things like that. And so what the goal with this book is really to get these ideas around emotional intelligence that we think are really, really important. The research shows that, and integrate that within a leadership model designed specifically for students. So the examples that we provide are about students who are leading in their organizations, leading in their communities, and we include some of their quotes and different things like that. We also saw this need to really bring an emotional intelligence piece to leadership. And I think that a lot of the models that we see out there, that this is inherent, but maybe not explicitly put out there as a key aspect of leadership. So I would say that it's a leadership model that's informed by emotional intelligence. So we see that in the three facets of leadership that we promote, which is consciousness of self. So this is really awareness of your abilities, your emotions, and your perceptions. Consciousness of others, so that ability of the awareness of the abilities, emotions, and perceptions of others. But then also that consciousness of context, which is around the situation and the setting that we're part of. And that, I think, wasn't as prevalent in a lot of leadership models, particularly at the time. So that was really what the aim of that book was, and I had the opportunity to use that with student leaders and first-year students in a leadership course when the first edition came out, and I really saw them connect to this model, and they talked about it in terms of these concepts they're kind of easy to understand, right? They're pretty simple in concept, but they're not necessarily easy to practice because it takes really trying to learn about yourself in a new way. So that's a little bit about, kind of how this book came about in the model.
Yeah, I love it. There's a couple of great lessons there. As I was reading it, it just felt so clear and simple, and lots of great stories from student leaders about the challenges they faced and the successes they had. And I was thinking, well, this is just very direct and very easy. And boy, I don't really do that. So this notion of it's easy to explain, harder to do really resonates with me. The other lesson I'll point out for many of our viewers is that if you have a textbook that you use and love, maybe you should see if you can be a co-author, because that seems to be, I didn't even know that was a thing you could do.
Oh, yeah.
So good for you. So this book that you helped develop is a guide for students, and so we kind of talked about that in terms of student leadership, which is important to many of the folks listening. But you also are a faculty member in a student affairs program, and you're helping turn out student affairs professionals and student affairs leaders. I'm just curious, how you've integrated this into your own role, not for student leaders, but your own role as a faculty member, as a student affairs practitioner, and as you're working on developing the next generation of student affairs professionals.
Yeah, great. So I shared earlier that I first started using this model as a leadership educator. And what was interesting is that while at the same time, while my students were really connecting with it and saying, wow, this makes sense. I never thought about it that way. And I'm going to start tracking, you know, how I feel different parts of the day and what are the things that make me get really excited or make me get really tense or nervous, and then how am I interacting with other people. So they were going through that, and at the same time I was going through that as an educator. And I think I'd heard about the concept of emotional intelligence before, but I never really thought about it in terms of my own practice. And so as they were going through it, I was going through it, which was really neat. And so I really realized that although we wrote this book for a specific audience in mind, students, these concepts actually translate into so many different settings, right? They translate to our work as student affairs professionals or college student educators, to our relationships that we have in our personal lives, to all those different types of things. And I've actually presented this model a number of professional conferences as a model for college student educators or student affairs professionals to use. And I give examples of some activities that they could do with students around this model. And every time I get the feedback that going through like an emotional inventory, for example, and thinking about what's an emotion that I felt really strongly in the last couple of weeks, and how did that affect my thought process? How did that affect my feelings? How did that affect my behaviors, other people? And then ultimately, what did I learn from that? Because at the end of the day, that's what's most important, is how do we learn from these experiences so that we can continue to improve? So we were going through this as an activity that you could use with students, and people were saying, oh my gosh, this is going to be so helpful for me in my role of so-and-so. And so we have a lot of different roles in our lives. And I would say that in student affairs, one piece where I think this could be really helpful is how do we use this to become a better supervisor? I think a lot of times we put a lot of focus on how we can be the best we can for working with our students, but sometimes that doesn't always translate to interacting with colleagues and supervisees. So this model can be helpful in that realm. I will also say that this model can translate across contexts. And so I was asked by some folks planning a conference on business communication in the United Arab Emirates to come out and do this model with the government leaders in Abu Dhabi. And I was like, oh my gosh, I got, kind of nervous about that. And then I said, well, let me tweak some things. And I pretty much presented something very similar that I might present to a student affairs audience. Of course, different examples. And these folks there just really ate it up. And so I think that this really shows that we need to be doing this in all of our different contexts that we're part of, and it does translate. So some capacities, I think that if we think about that supervision piece that I brought up, some capacities that I think are important for us to really embrace and that I really work on with my graduate students in the leadership course that I teach is the initial pieces that are the foundation of this model related to emotional intelligence, which is about emotional self-perception. So really being able to identify emotions that we have and the influence that they have on their behavior or our behavior. And then emotional self-control, which is consciously being able to moderate those emotions. So that's really a foundation. In order for us to do all the types of things that we do, we really need to have a grasp on those pieces within us, or else we might get have this experience, and then all of a sudden we're behaving and acting in ways that aren't reflective of who we want to be. Coaching others. So this is a capacity we have, and this is about enhancing the skills and abilities of others. And I think this is so important. The difference I see in really high quality internship supervisors or graduate assistant supervisors compared to those who may not fall into that category is when supervisors really care about developing and coaching others and really working to help understand the people that they're working with and find ways that they can continue to develop, which of course is one of the goals when we're working with graduate students. And the last ones I'll say is really as leaders of our offices, of our divisions, this focus on consciousness of context. So being able to analyze the group and understand group dynamics and being able to assess the larger environment that we're leading in and being able to interpret those external forces and how that's going to have an impact on our department is more important now than ever because we're seeing so much change happening really very fast here on campuses. So So yeah, those are just some ideas I have around how this model not only works for college population, but for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really great. And I'm hearing as you're describing your own learning, a lot of mindfulness, which is one of the things that's really comes up again and again and again in Marilee's book about, this book that's very scientific about neuroscience really recommends mindfulness and meditation and all of those as tools to help us do that. And just you saying again and again what you're noticing and what you're bringing up and helping other people notice things, how powerful that can be. And it's also a never-ending process. I want to shift over to Mamta. I'm noticing here that we're bringing a lot of warmth, which is maybe appropriate for our emotional intelligence conversation. But we have panelists from Florida, San Diego, and Texas. I'm holding it down here in the cold fall of Minnesota. So I appreciate the warmth that everybody's bringing. But Mamta, you're a vice president for student affairs. You're in the role that maybe many of our viewers and listeners are aspiring to or looking towards, and the kind of trying to develop themselves as professionals and as leaders and as people to get there. I'd just love for you to talk with us about how emotional intelligence shows up in your practice as a leader, and perhaps how that's evolved and changed over time.
So again, thank you so much for having me as part of this team. The examples that I'm going to offer are going to come largely from the many mistakes that I've made and continue to make as an educator. I think, and I don't say that out of a space of self-flogging. I say that because we're all learning, right? And so I have to chuckle when I'm in conversations like this, because I feel like if I had that time turner, and if the version of me from 10 years ago was listening in on this conversation, she would say, oh my gosh, that woman is a bunch of garbage, And so, because in my early career, and a lot of this, Marilee brought up, the notions of intersectionality. In my early career, particularly in the intersecting identities that I have as a cis woman, and as a person of color, I had this mindset, I have to work. There are tasks, right? I was a very, excellence is grounded in the tasks that I accomplish. Because because excellence, and that's how I defined excellence, was important to me. But then on top of that, the added pressure of you need to do that much more because of these identities. So what that meant for me is that in an unintended way, I sacrificed the emotional intelligence conversation because, again, I've been challenged to not use the language soft skills because that minimizes the work that we do. But these skills that are attributed again, for various patriarchal reasons, impact us in different ways. They situate our leadership in ways that are perceived as less than. But I sacrificed that. And so the me from 10 years ago was, I'm not going to eat lunch with people because my lunch is on my own time. And my work is about these programs that I do or these workshops that I have. And you need to understand content and skill and content and skill. And I've changed. So it's taken a long time and I still have a lot of personal work to do, but I need to take ownership of my own work because this is a daily work in progress for me. I identify as a Vulcan. And so to navigate how I present emotional intelligence is something, it's not an easy thing. I don't want to send a message that we just arrive in this way. I think it's active work, as my colleagues have kind of named, that there's this much research on this. So for me, when I think about how it shows up in our work, I didn't come up with this phrase and I can't remember who did, but specifically in our field, we're in the work of human beings, not human doings. Right? And so if we're in the work of human beings, then our relationships become the most important. How we cultivate and facilitate relationships across any level of our field is the most important thing we do. And so if our relationships with one another are the most important thing we do, I feel like that's the most important space where we need to put our time and energy and spirit. When I think about the work that I do as an educator, even at this level, but if I were to look back and say, how could I have done things differently at other junctures in my career? I would say a good 60% of my time is relationships and 40% is the transactive elements of the tasks that we do. Because the human relationship is the most important thing. And so, I want to own that that's the frame that I enter. So when you ask, how does this show up for me in my leadership? Well, it means when I'm sitting with an angry parent, even if they disagree with what I have to say, or I disagree with what they have to say, that there's a request, there's an ache in them needing to be heard as they advocate for their student. It means in a student conduct process, of which we have all of the power in that situation. We might not feel that way, but we create the process, we facilitate the process, so we own a lot. So to be able to sit in community with students as they're trying to navigate their understanding of processes like a student conduct process, or an appeal process, or a leadership program, or a cultural festival, or a protest, it means that we are aware of the energy we bring to a space. We're aware of the parameters that we're the valve, right? We facilitate the relationships. That we're aware of those parameters that we create. We're aware of the parameters of which we have no control, and that to me, again, we reference the term compassion. What I love about emotional intelligence is it transcends compassion, right? Transcending from compassion to empathy, which is kind of a sense of being able to understand the emotional energy in the space, in community with people. So I can't think of a more important value and practice in our field than this particular one.
Yeah, I love as you're describing this, you're talking about shifts to really focus on your relationships with other people. But as you describe that shift, it was really about the relationship with yourself. Absolutely. So that's another part of the emotional intelligence, and not just with the other, but with self, and how that has come along. That's wonderful. You do a lot of great social justice work on your campus, and you consult and you help other individuals and institutions do a lot of great social justice work. How is this incorporated into the social justice work, and how does it connect there?
Thank you. And I loved thinking about this question. So I'm appreciative of having the opportunity to reflect on this with our community. I want to start first by saying that I entered the profession through different media. I was a university ombudsman, so through conflict resolution, that was an early career job for me, and then multicultural affairs. And so I think about those early career experiences that I'm so grateful for, that have shaped my perspective over time. And so adding to that, my theoretical lenses, which I would argue also inform my leadership philosophy and practice, are grounded in critical race theory and post-colonial feminism. So those are the theoretical frames that, even as an educator and administrator right now, those are the lenses that I engage in the community. So I just want to be transparent about that. And so when I think about those educators that have shaped my thinking, I think about this notion of cultural intuition. So Dolores Delgado Bernal kind of identified through Chicana feminist epistemology this idea of cultural intuition, where there's a wisdom that comes with all of who we are, right? And while she's speaking from a space of a Chicana feminist way of knowing and being, I would take a moment and say that emotional intelligence, when applied in the most thoughtful, inclusive way, allows for all levels of weighing, knowing, and wisdom to enter the conversation, right? So if we're connecting with each other, then when our students are protesting, our consciousness is not, oh my gosh, we're managing the problem, there's a protest. Our way of entering is, there is a weighing and knowing that our students are trying to articulate to us that we are not recognizing, right? So if we apply emotional intelligence to the other theoretical frames, all of a sudden what we have now is a pathway to be in authentic relationship with people, not in this, oh, we are the helper field, so let's help other people, right? We enter in with another phrase that I want to offer, cultural humility. And cultural humility, Ajay Nair, who is the senior vice president and dean of students at Emory University, also talks about this. But cultural humility comes from the medical field and essentially multicultural medical education. We should learn a lot from doctors, because they early on in the 90s began thinking about what's the privilege power differential between doctor and client, right? And so what's the power imbalance there? Because people have wisdom of their bodies. They might not know how to treat themselves, but what are the privilege and power dynamics between doctor and patient? And we can learn a lot from that. And within cultural humility, which I think, again, dimensions of cultural humility feed directly into this idea of emotional intelligence because there are three elements. That self-reflection piece, which shows up along with a lifelong commitment to self-reflection, not just a moment. But I would then add a recognition of a power imbalance. So that's, I think, where the social justice component comes in. But then also being in partnership with communities. So if we were to shift our work, I think emotional intelligence allows us to shift our work from cultural competence, which I think we talk about in our field, to cultural humility. And then it allows us to enter in really authentic spaces that weave in acknowledgement of privilege and power to the justice-based conversations that we want to have, to our every basic practice. So I'll give the example, I keep bringing up student conduct. There could be a student conduct sanction that has a differential impact on an international student than on a domestic student. And yes, we have to be consistent, and yes, we have to care about the community. But if there's a differential impact that situates a student in a way that is that much more significant, we have a duty of care to think about that, right? And I think emotional intelligence allows us to sit in a space of humility, to sit in a space of what is that student's cultural intuition? How am I linking myself to that in a way that allows me to elevate and lead from a space of humanity rather than from a space of power? Mm-hmm. So then I'm distributing or leveraging my power and my role in a way that's more thoughtful.
You know, that so resonates with me, and I'm thinking more and more about the need to center healing and social justice work. Not just for those who are oppressed, but also those who experience dominance and privilege. So I think there's a lot of healing that happens there. And that is really coming through in a compassionate activism course through folks at Everyday Feminism on healing from toxic whiteness. It's just great. And it's really connected to so much of what we're talking about here. Marilee, I love that you're talking about this in many different contexts and bringing so many things in. And Paige is talking about doing this around the world. And Marilee, you're getting more notoriety. That's what happens when you edit a book and you do good work, and being invited literally all over the world to talk about emotional intelligence and how we incorporate this in to bring about greater justice and greater equity, and really addressing some of the most challenging things that our globe faces. Could you just tell us a little bit about some of the lessons you're learning and the most powerful points that you're taking away from some of those experiences?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just really so grateful to be here with all of you and learning from Paige and Mamta and Mamta. And what I want to build on is, yes, I'm feeling very grateful to be working with UNESCO and the Mahatma Gandhi Institute for Education and Peace. And we'll be spending a lot of time there next semester as we work to, in an interdisciplinary team, to design a curriculum, if you will, but it's very student affairs-y. Of course it is. That seeks to educate the prevention of violent extremism. So, and the United States is a country that I hope will benefit, because we are experiencing violent extremism, and it's heartbreaking. And building off of Paige's work and Mamta's examples, I want to illustrate really moving toward this awareness of self, awareness of others, and awareness of context, and the cultural humility and the cultivating of partnerships. What we're doing is inviting in, using mindfulness methodology, inviting in this, again, awareness of emotions and the role they play in regulating what gets stored and recalled into memory, as well as the role they play in our decision-making and prioritizing of decision-making. And as we witness violence, whether it's verbal or physical or emotional, the sense of violence, it's very real. We can see it in the body, right? And the idea of this is that I can't possibly know what someone's lived experience is. And so if I'm trying to guide them through a curriculum, that's designed for one size fits all, these partnerships are incredibly important. So really what I see us doing more is saying, here are some methodologies that we know cultivate attention regulation, understanding where my attention is, that cultivates emotional awareness. And then, Paige, we're using self-regulation, just monitoring that, because we've noticed that just the words control in some cultures then ignites sort of a suppression or avoidance. And then we're also wrapping this in compassion. And we use compassion very specifically because of the neuroscience part of that, around that we can see empathy as a part of that, that feeling for. Then there's a cognitive perspective taking. And as we're doing this work, like hearing the stories of violence, being with it, as you mentioned, like practicing myself to just be with that, with someone in their retelling, that there's an offering of kindness that needs to take place. And it's like I know this sounds like Southern California hippie talk, but it's not, because we can see it in the body. There's this offering of kindness, this felt sense of offering kindness. And then there's the action part. There's the action part, the willingness. There's a willingness to alleviate of the pain. And then there's the action part. And I think this is really important because as I think about your examples that you were giving, Mamta, of protests. So there's this feeling for this cognitive perspective taking, and then there's the, what are we going to do with this? What are we going to do with this? And so the work that we're doing with the violent extremism is to say, yes, all of this is true, but somewhere along the way, in the push-pull factors that contribute to the creating of violent extremist behavior, what seems to be a common line is there's a shifting of difficult emotions to now becoming destructive emotions, and the actions that, the behavior that comes out of destructive emotions. So the idea, and Paige, you spoke of this so much, is this cultivating awareness of self and others and context. If we can really get those seeds planted, and as Mamta said, it's not just a one-time thing. This is a lifelong practice because context is always changing. Self is changing, others are changing. Then can we empower those who are experiencing violence in whatever form to not give over to the understandable destruction that those emotions can ignite, and then the behavior that then comes out of it.
I really appreciate you bringing us to this mindfulness, because I think there's often a misunderstanding of mindfulness is I'm going to go sit in a quiet place by myself and meditate and pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist. But really mindfulness is being with the realities that are in the world, and not avoiding them, not running from them, not pretending them with, but accepting them as realities. And once we accept them, we can become more effective in addressing them and reaching them and really getting at the roots rather than the symptoms. And that's what you're talking about. In seeing, I love this notion of how do we address the difficult emotions so they don't become destructive emotions. And wishing those difficult emotions away is not going to work.
No.
But I think one of the things that was really a takeaway for me in reading your book on the neuroscience of learning and development is that again and again and again, authors kept coming back to mindfulness and meditation as tools for learning, for development, for growth. And I think we talk a lot in student affairs about reflection, which is a super critical part of this. And to me, maybe mindfulness meditation is maybe a deeper level of that reflection, and not just what do I know or what did I hear, what just happened, but then who am I and how does that connect and who do I want to be? So I would love to see if Mamta or Paige has thoughts about how we could integrate. We talk a lot about integrating reflection in the learning beyond the classroom, but do you see spaces and ways that we could integrate mindfulness and meditation in to help students learn and grow, which is our job?
So I have a thought. Again, full transparency. Growing up Hindu, there are certain texts, that I grew up reading, and a lot of this mindfulness, comes from Buddhist or a frame, could be from a Buddhist frame, and there's lots of links between Buddhism and Hinduism, and so I offer the text that actually informs all of my practice now as an educator, which is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And essentially, when we talk about yogic practice, yoga is not intended to be a physical practice, right? It's a practice over time so that you can prepare your body to sit for meditation to then attain salvation. So if I can use that metaphor, reflection is a moment by moment thing, right? Mindfulness is reflection over a sustained amount of time. So that is that continual practice. Now, when we develop the discipline to have that sustained practice, then that will take us on a path to sustained practice, and therefore then arguably mutual or personal liberation. That's kind of, if I can put that in that space. So when I think about how do we cultivate contemplative practices in our institution everywhere all the time, and so that it's not just reflections in this class, but that reflection is happening all the time. So if all of us are working in unison and in shared partnership, then by design, in the same way that you would for a core curriculum, right? When you create a gen ed curriculum, what you're saying is there are a constellation of learning experiences that students need to have a well-rounded education. That's around the ways of knowing, but around the ways of being, what would it look like to have a core curriculum, if you will, practice around mindfulness? I think it's how we all embed reflection in everything that we do, and then that in and of itself would result in a mindful practice.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm a little curious about how we move this into some of our practice as well. And I'd just love to hear, if we can just hear from each of you briefly. You've written, you've thought about this, you've talked about this, you've got a lot of expertise, but what are the things that maybe you're reading or that are pushing your learning or that are just so outstanding that you just love to recommend to other folks who join this and are interested in this conversation? We've certainly plugged the 2 books plenty, but are there things that you would recommend? Maybe we'll start with you, Paige.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to build off of what Mamta was saying too, and it bridges the 2 questions. I did my doctorate work at the University of San Diego, and it was actually a doctorate in leadership studies, as opposed to like a higher ed or student affairs realm. And I got to learn about a lot of really neat stuff there. And I took a class actually on action inquiry. So it's not action research, it's action inquiry, which is connected to action research. But through that, and we actually had the author of this book, Action Inquiry, his name's Bill Torbert. He actually came and taught the class for us. But what I learned from that was I found ways to observe myself, my relationships, and my environments in action, in real time, kind of like that triple loop learning you hear about in organizational learning, where it becomes a practice of observing yourself in action and making meaning of that, so that you can conduct yourself and interact with people in a way that is that's authentic. And so that's probably a simplified way of putting that. Another way that I've kind of heard this talked about is conscious living. So that is something that I found has really been valuable for me. And sometimes that's as little as stopping myself, not really actually stopping myself while I'm walking or something like that, but when something strikes me, to just kind of pause and think about, almost like if people are familiar with work about adaptive leadership, this idea of being on a balcony. So can I kind of have this like little page above me looking down and say, wow, what's going on right now that's making this happen, and trying to analyze that in the moment. And I mentioned this earlier, the goal is not perfection, right? The goal is not that we're going to be able to be perfect all the time, because that's not possible. So approaching all of this with the goal of trying to learn and trying to continue to develop so that we can be our best selves. Because when we're able to be our best selves, we're able to then be the best educator we can be, partner we can be, all those types of things. So that's one piece that I am still working on, and I actually, in preparing for this today, thought I need to go back and look at that work again because it's been a little while. But what I was simultaneously teaching to a group of students in the leadership minor there at the University of San Diego was a class where we actually created the class, right? So my goal at the beginning of the semester was, it was their capstone class, let's create this class together. And I'm here as your facilitator. And we decided to read a book in the class called Presence, Human Purpose in the Field of the Future. And it's by Senge, Sharma, Jaworski, and Flowers. And this really made me rethink a lot about what I was thinking around leadership, and then myself, and presence, basically, and how we can be mindful. So I encourage folks to look at both of those. Neither of those are like brand new releases or anything like that, but I think that they're very relevant for work today.
Yeah, and for those folks who are listening, Erica Thompson's doing a great job getting some of these books that people are mentioning and links out to them on the Twitter hashtag. You're reminding me, I'm going to credit this to Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but yeah, describing that mindfulness is not thinking about enlightenment while you're doing the dishes. Mindfulness is only doing the dishes. And that's what you're talking about, just being right there in that moment. Marilee, do you have a resource you'd like to recommend or encourage to folks?
I would, yes, thank you. I have two. One is Chad-Ming Tan's book, Search Inside Yourself. Mm-hmm. And the reason I recommend that is it has a lot of short 2-minute, 4-minute practices that are easy to embed in whatever it is that you're designing or your day-to-day, and that's search inside yourself. And one of those practices is the stop, breathe, notice, reflect, respond, and I would add offering kindness. The other one is Radical Dharma by Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. Really beautiful, powerful contextualization of how mindfulness can be a solid foundation for racial and social justice practices.
Lovely. And I would just add that Search Inside Yourself, as you mentioned, is full of great little things that would be so easy to incorporate into a talk to RAs or a talk to orientation leaders or a welcome session for parents. Just little short snippets that are easily drop in without having to be a whole hour-long thing.
Yeah, so and his Joy on Demand book is just out, and that's got a lot of really fun short snippets too.
Mamta, you have some things that you're excited about directing us to?
I am.
In your face, it's wonderful.
Well, I'm inspired. I get to be in community with all of you. This is great. I just realized it's on my bookshelf, so I was just pulling it. So again, it's interesting and amazing how all of us have kind of drawn from outside the field, which is great, right? That allows for that creative, interdisciplinary strengthening of how we are in community. So a book that I've been, of course, talking for the past year that I've been obsessed with, and I need to explain how I got there. I was really inspired by a piece that Robin DiAngelo wrote around white fragility. Now, I when she explained the concept and kind of coined that phrase around fragility, she spoke of it in race, but fragility across dominant identities, and when do dominant identities kind of react in certain ways to fragility. It got me thinking about, wow, like fragility, where'd she get that? Where's that, and what would it mean to not be that? And so in my very scientific approach, I was like, the opposite of fragility would be anti-fragility. So let me look that up. And so this is how I stumbled across this book. Anti-Fragile is the name of the book, and it's Anti-Fragile, Things That Gain from Disorder. It's actually part of a trilogy, which I haven't read the other two books, but by the author's name is Taleb. And essentially, it got me thinking about, in our field, we have tended to, in our frame of education, to react and respond. But and we've gotten to the space of grit and resilience, right? In our field, you hear about that a lot. How do we cultivate spaces for grit and resilience? Well, Taleb kind of challenges that in other frames of existence, that in resilience, like imagine a rubber band, you just bounce back. But we want students to be stronger. I don't want, if we're just creating environments where people just bounce back to where they are, we're perpetuating status quo, right? And so think about why we have to get flu shots every year, because the flu virus is anti-fragile. It continues to evolve and get stronger, right? And so that's why we need to be vaccinated every year to keep up. And so nature has, I have to use my science degree in somehow. So here we go.
Great.
That nature has many examples of anti-fragility. And so what would it look like if we incorporated an anti-fragile consciousness in our communities? And I think when you pull in emotional intelligence, I think that is a core pillar of anti-fragility, because it then equips all of us across dimensions of identity, those that have been minoritized and those that are in dominant spaces, to think about, okay, how do I be present in community? And then how do I emerge through these moments as stronger and more in community and more present? And I think anti-fragility allows us to get there. So that's one piece. I realized I forgot to credit around cultural humility, the authors or scholars of that work, Tervalon and Murray Garcia, and that's a 1998, I think was the first time they, at least the piece that I draw from. And it comes from multicultural education in the medical field. And then I'm going to go back to, I think about when pedagogy of the oppressed was first introduced to our field, right? That really transformed how we thought about our work. So I want to take a similar nudge to what would it look like if we pulled in Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is a short 4-chapter, less than 100-page read that talks about the discipline and the practice of our work in liberation. But then if we translate that to our work as educators, we want our students to have thriving, full lives in community with one another. And so I think the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali really allow us to get there. Again, this is not like a religious text. It's a spiritual practice. So in as much as one is open to kind of reading that, I would definitely encourage that. So those are the pieces that frame, some of the pieces that frame my thinking around emotional intelligence.
Great. And I just want to keep giving huge kudos to Erica Thompson, who is actually keeping up with all of the book recommendations and pushing them out with links on the hashtags. So she's doing an amazing job. And so if you're missing some of these or scurrying writing them down, you can go to the hashtag and find that there. We had a couple other things that we were going to kind of touch on, but we're running out of time. And so rather than jump to those, I'd like to just try and get maybe 90 seconds of each of your kind of final thoughts. I imagine you came here with things, and if you're anything like me, you're hearing other people share and talk, and it's bursting new ideas and connections that you want to make. As you ponder that, I think we'll move to Marilee next, but Mamta, I heard you speak so brilliantly about anti-fragile on a previous webinar, and I just love that. And since then, I keep hearing people who are really, really smart recommend that book. So it's on my list, and it keeps moving up and up and up. Yeah. So that keeps coming up again in very different contexts, from social justice context to venture capitalist context to all sorts of different things. So any book that Mamta Accapadi recommends and Harris recommends, there's got to be something going on there from those very different perspectives. So, but Marilee, do you want to offer us just kind of any concluding thoughts or things that you want to tie together?
Yes, thank you. I want to build on what I heard Paige and Mamta suggest. The books Paige suggested and the books Mamta suggested reminded me of another book, Otto Scharmer's Theory U book in there about creating transformation. And I like to think of this idea, going back to Mamta's anti-fragile, around, we talk about this with students a lot, about the process of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. And that is an intentional willing self-destruction and a repurposing into something other than what existed before in order to transform into something else, something with different abilities, something that completely different abilities. So in this process of emotional intelligence serving as a bedrock, and mindfulness practices that I was looking for. I've got the Patanjali's book over here. I was going to grab it.
Yeah.
I can't get my hands on it. It's too far away. But in whatever practices it is of the wisdom traditions, of the spiritual practices, but bringing them back in, so we're not afraid to allow students to actually bring these in, so that all we're doing is creating an environment of that cocoon, like wrapping it in compassion, so that we can actually really create something different than what we have, and we just have to.
That's a beautiful metaphor, and I think as I do leadership coaching with individuals, the question that's often very powerful is, who are you becoming? And I think that evokes that caterpillar to butterfly. Paige, do you have a thought that you want to kind of conclude us with and wrap us up with?
Yes. So I recently came into the new role and identity of being a mother, which is really fun. And I'm starting to think about raising a child and all that type of stuff. And I've also been noticing, and maybe I'm just more in tune to it now, but a lot of stuff being put out there now about how emotional intelligence is so important to be developing in our kids. From a very young age. I just heard something on NPR last week. I don't know if any of you heard that as well, but this E is for empathy from Sesame Street that is now going on. And I really think that this is something that we as professionals and as educators need to be embracing. We need to be continuing the research on this. We need to be working on this with students, but we really need to be developing this in our youth. And one piece that stuck out to me from that NPR story was that empathy and emotional intelligence isn't about being able to have manners and to be polite to people. Yes. It's about kindness. It's about understanding and grace and compassion. And actually, when kids can be more emotionally intelligent, things like bullying goes down and decreases, and other things like that. And so I guess that's one thing I'm going to be paying more attention to. And I'd imagine some of you who are parents, or people who are listening who are parents, have been thinking about these things as well. And we need to be sharing these ideas with each other.
Great. Mamta?
I'm so thankful that the parent, thank you so much, Paige, for the parent reference, because that is a salient identity for me and has informed my practice as well. Before I kind of reflect on that, I want to also remind us that in this conversation around emotional intelligence, to me, this is about self-work. So what I have to be really thoughtful in my own self is this is not my job to go to my colleagues and diagnose other people as to their levels and degree of emotional intelligence, because what it means disrupting our privilege and power frame of, if somebody shows up with anger, we can't say, oh my gosh, that person's not emotionally intelligent because someone shows up with anger and another person cries, right? I mean, it's about acknowledging the roots of where people's stories come from. And this is not something we overlay on other people. This is self-work. So I just wanted to offer that as a tiny reflection. And then the other that my daughter has probably taught me more about this than anyone I know. And I'm in a My Little Pony phase right now. It's building my character. I don't like My Little Pony, but my daughter has been bugging me to watch the show, and I was like, it's a silly show. I'm not going to do it. And then she sat me down. She said, it really makes me feel disrespected that you made a judgment about my show without watching it. And she was like, you talk about inclusion, but you haven't even seen the show. And so, and in a parent moment, I could have said, well, I'm not going to watch your show. It irritates. And so I sat down with her and I sat through a 45-minute episode of My Little Pony, and against every element of well-being. And the show is a great show, and she was learning great things from that. And then she sat with me and said, see, you have to always practice what you're doing, what you say you do. And it's a continual reminder, day in and day out practice. Even when we think we're moving on a path, it is daily and it is everywhere. And so I just offer that wisdom from an 8-year-old from My Little Pony.
Yeah, yoga practice, meditation practice, and now my pony practice.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you to each of our guests today, and thanks always to our program sponsors. Heather Shea Gasser will be back next week on November 2nd with an episode on the 2016 election, where this is a relevant topic, and the implications for student affairs and higher education with Julie Payne-Kirschmeyer, Nancy Thomas, and Vijay Pendekar. Also, Tony Duty will have his guest, Dr. Josie Alquist and Dr. Ike Bellant, on November 16th, so they discuss their New Directions publication, Engaging the Digital Generation. You can receive reminders about this and other great shows by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can also browse the archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to our iTunes podcast. I'm Keith Edwards, filling in for Tony Duty. Thanks for watching, everyone. We hope you make it a wonderful week. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.